Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone here at the Book Club of California and online in our Zoom universe. Welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online presentation by author and professor of history at City College of San Francisco, Dr. Alexandra Nicholas, right here. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director for the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. For those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and literature of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on a wide range of topics, including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. Now, if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, shame on you, I strongly encourage you to consider membership. Our dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the Book Club of California without your support. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. Program, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, A Life of Power and Politics. It is an in-person and online presentation by author and professor of history at City College of San Francisco, Dr. Alexandra Nicholas. Dr. Alexandra Nicholas' first book is this highly regarded and positively reviewed biography, again, titled Phoebe Apperson Hearst, A Life of Power and Politics. Phoebe Apperson Hearst was one of the Gilded Age's most prominent and powerful women in the Bay Area. She was a financial manager, a businesswoman, a reformer, and a philanthropist. She was born into a middle-class rural Missouri family in 1842, and she died a powerful member of society's urban elite in 1919. Most people know her as the mother of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul, and as the wife of George Hearst, the mining tycoon and US senator. But from age 48 until her death, Phoebe Apperson Hearst shepherded the family fortune, demonstrating intelligence and skill as a financial manager. Tonight, Alexandra Nicholas will share a portrait of this powerful and often contradictory woman. Now, in terms of the logistics, again, today's webinar will include a presentation by Dr. Nicholas and then a Q&A session. If you're joining us via Zoom and have questions or comments, you can use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A in Zoom and also take questions here in the audience. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alexandra Nicholas.
Well, I'm delighted to be here tonight to tell you the story of Phoebe Apperson Hearst and her life of power and politics. She was born and raised in rural Missouri by Cumberland, is that good? Cumberland Presbyterian parents. The Cumberland Presbyterians were a radical reform wing of the Presbyterian Church. And they raised Phoebe to grow up, get married, have children, be a dignified, respectable lady. And of course, that role placed constraints on her life. But they also taught her to be ambitious, self-supporting, and get involved in useful and active work. Now, when she was quite young, she had dreams about going to California and living in a nice house with her husband and hopefully 6 kids running around and becoming active in California life. But she understood at an early age that if that was going to happen, if she was going to be able to realize her dreams and ambitions, she had to marry the right man to take her out of rural Missouri. And he came along, his name was George Hearst. The Hearsts lived close to the Appersons, not very far away. They were the wealthiest family in the area. And George came out to California in 1850 to make his fortune. And he was called back to rural Missouri in 1860 when his mother fell ill. And shortly after he came back, she passed away. And by this point, George is 40 years old. He figures it's time for him to get married, settle down, and have a son and heir. So he decides to reacquaint himself with his neighbor, Phoebe Apperson, who is 22 years younger. And he asks her to marry him. She accepts his offer. And the day before they get married in June of 1862, they sign a prenuptial contract in which George hands over to Phoebe 50 shares of stock in one of his gold and silver mining companies. Now, this is a bit unusual in the 19th century. This created a separate and independent estate for Phoebe Apperson Hearst, which was rather unusual for any married woman during this period. But then in the fall of 1862, after they married, they came out to San Francisco, a topsy-turvy place. And George shattered Phoebe's dream almost immediately of living in a nice house when he informed her they were going to live in the Lick Hotel. Now, the Lick Hotel was the most luxurious hotel in San Francisco. It was where all the ambitious and up-and-coming people stayed, but Phoebe didn't like the place. It was too pretentious for her. She wanted to live in a quieter, family-oriented hotel, and George wanted to make her happy. So they moved to the Stevenson Hotel, where in April of 1863, their one and only child, William Randolph Hearst, was born, seen here with his mother in 1863. Now, as soon as Willie was born, George got up and left. And from this point on in their marriage, George was an absentee husband and father. I mean, once in a while, he would come back to visit and stay a little while. But he loved the world of mining, and that's where he spent most of his time, that and pursuing his political interests. But that left Phoebe alone. She was terribly lonely. She was disillusioned with her marriage, dissatisfied. She wrote George of her feelings, and George was satisfied doing what he was doing. He loved the world of mining. So he wanted to make his wife happy. So early on in their marriage, George hands over to Phoebe control of a large part of his fortune. And this is really the first step Phoebe takes toward acquiring and building power in her life. About 10 years later, when Phoebe is 30 years old, seen here in 1872, George suggests that Phoebe and Willie go off to New York, that he meet them there, and then they all travel to attend the Vienna International Exposition. But then George reneges on his promise, and that leaves Phoebe in a difficult position. She has to decide now whether she wants to go to Europe with Willie by herself or not go. And after she mulls this over for a while, she decides she better take advantage of this opportunity because she did not know when this opportunity would present itself again. Now, this is going to be the first of many trips that Phoebe makes to Europe in the course of her life. And this first one is a transformative experience for her. It's going to change her life significantly. Now, she takes with her on this trip an internal contradiction that she grapples with her entire life between moralism and materialism. The Cumberland Presbyterians believed that money and wealth was a corrupt and corrosive influence on people's lives. But George gives Phoebe $10,000 for this trip. So when she gets to Europe, she's at first rather uncomfortable spending George's money. But after a while, she comes up with a rationale in her own mind for spending George's money. And that rationale is she concludes that Americans think it's okay for women married to wealthy men to spend their husband's money if they spend it on self-education and self-improvement, which is what she does. And as soon as she comes to this realization, She becomes comfortable in spending George's money, and she has a wonderful time. She comes back to the United States and then goes back to Europe in the late 1870s. She returns to the United States, and in the early 1880s, Phoebe Apperson Hearst begins to get involved in women's nonpartisan voluntary associations and their politics. Now, there were thousands of these groups in the United States at the time. Many of these women's organizations were legally chartered. They were incorporated bodies. They had constitutions and bylaws. Members had the right to vote within their organization. So these women had power within their groups, and they were going to attempt to extend that power into their local communities, as I will explain. And here we see one of the myriad of organizations that Phoebe got involved in. And there she is right there. And she's sitting next to Alice Burney. And these two are the co-founders of the National Congress of Mothers, established in 1897, which you and I know today as the PTA, which is still operating in this country today. Now, the avenue that Phoebe Hearst takes into the world of women's organizations is initially through the kindergarten movement. In the early 1880s, she begins to give gifts to the Golden Gate Kindergarten Association, the GGKA, and get involved in that organization. She makes it clear how she wants her money spent, two ways primarily. One, to establish free kindergarten classes for the children of working class, poor, and immigrant parents. And secondly, she wants her money to be used to train women to become professional kindergarten teachers. Now, in the late 19th century, there's not many professions open to women. So this is going to be a new profession open to women to become a kindergarten teacher. Her money, as well as her work within the organization, make her a director of the GGKA, which of course increases her status and gives her power within that group. She is able, through her gifts and activities in this organization, to build a name and a reputation for herself, which brings her to the attention of people involved in the field of medicine. Phoebe Hearst decides that she wants to work toward getting women advanced in the field of medicine. She becomes president of the Pacific Homeopathic Dispensary or Hospital in San Francisco. And this is where male grads from the Hahnemann Medical College in San Francisco went after graduation to get an advanced clinical and medical training. So her goal is to get the male physicians and officials at the college, as well as the male grads, to accept and work with the female physicians and staff at the dispensary. And she is successful in doing this by using her philanthropic power to pressure the men into this position. She threatens to withdraw her money from the dispensary. It was her money that kept the dispensary open and operating. So if the dispensary closed, that would mean the male graduates would have no place to go for their advanced medical and clinical training. So as a result of putting pressure on the men, she gets them eventually to accept working with these female physicians and staff at the dispensary. Then Phoebe Hearst broadens and complicates her political agenda in these organizations by getting involved in the Century Club of California, which is still operating as well in San Francisco. She becomes the first president of this group from 1888 to 1890. The first meetings are in her home. Once the club is up and running, using her money, she pays the rent for a suitable meeting place. And by this point, most of the members of the club, when she is president, believe that she has the ability and the resources to make the club into, and I'm quoting from the archives now, an undoubted power, end quote. They were interested in really shaping the group into an organization with some kind of power. Now, one way they tried to do this is by getting involved in the 1888 San Francisco School Board election, which is traditional male partisan politics. One half of the leadership of the Century Club, including Hearst, gets involved in this election. California law allowed females to run for the school board in the state, but not to vote in the election. All right, so you can see where I'm going with this. Hearst gets involved. She joins the Committee of 100 to support and back these female candidates who want to kick the male board members off the board because they are supported by the corrupt political boss at the time, Christopher Blind Boss Buckley, who is allowing the school system really to deteriorate in San Francisco. Half of the female candidates who run in this election are Century Club members. Hearst announces that she will pay off all their campaign debts, which she does. They don't win, but they prove that they are viable political candidates. They get votes in this election. So that's a step in the right direction for them, all right? Now, while Phoebe Hearst is getting involved in all these women's organizations, her husband, George Hearst, is getting involved in politics besides the world of mining. And in 1886, Governor George Stoneman, California, names George Hearst as the US Senator from California to replace US Senator John Miller, who had just passed away. So that means the Hearsts must move to Washington, DC, which they do so in 1886. And this is one of the homes they live in early on when they are there on 1400 New Hampshire Avenue Northwest. And George gets involved, of course, in national politics in Washington, DC, which Phoebe abhors. She doesn't like the rough and tumble world of male partisan politics in the nation's capital, but she is interested in helping her husband advance his political career and gaining acceptance for the Hearsts into the political, social, and intellectual elite circles in the nation's capital. So the way that she attempts to do this is she gets involved in her first architectural project. Now, architecture was one of the fields that it was acceptable for women to get involved in. Another field is anthropology that I'll talk about later. So this was an acceptable field, and Hearst decides to commission Harvey L. Page as the architect to renovate the inside of this home in 1889. And he uses a style of architecture that Phoebe favored at the time. And this project is a magnificent success. It's reported on in newspapers and published articles, so forth and so on. And here's a image of the inside of the renovated living room, which is declared as being very fashionable. And so she's able to accomplish her goals. She advances the Hearst name in the capital, and she gains acceptance for the Hearsts while they are staying there in elite circles. But then something unexpected happens. He's not anticipating this, certainly. George Hearst, in late February of 1891, passes away. And Phoebe is beside herself. She really doesn't know what to do. Normally, she was a very confident, optimistic, active individual. And she's taken aback. She finally decides that she's going to leave the capital, Washington, D.C., and she comes out to Sonoma County and establishes what she calls Camp Sesame. She erects a tent and she stays there for several months to try and figure out what her future holds as a 48-year-old widow. She really doesn't know. And while she's there, George Hearst's will is read, and in it, he hands control over to Phoebe his entire estate. He does not bequeath 1 cent to William Randolph Hearst, who is a spendthrift. Money goes through his hands like water. So George Hearst trusted his wife's ability to manage his money. However, George stipulates in this will that if Phoebe Hearst ever remarries, 1/2 of the estate will revert to their son. So even in death, George sets limits on Phoebe's life. So what do you think Phoebe does? Does she remarry? No. No, she does not. Okay. So it takes her a few years in probate to gain full control of this estate, which she does, and she's tested immediately. Now, this is a vast estate. It has many properties in it. It's complicated. And when she gains control, she knows virtually nothing about this estate. So she has to teach herself very quickly. Now, she's fortunate in that she has the benefit of inheriting George's lawyers and his business managers. But she makes it quite clear early on that she wants them to send to her all the important documents so she can read them and sign off on them. So she has control of this estate from start to finish in her life, from the time she's 48 years old on. And as a result, she, over the course of this period, builds a reputation for herself as a good businesswoman. Now, once she settles in for a few years and learning how to manage and control this estate, Phoebe Hearst begins to make systematic and strategic decisions to express and exert her power as a wealthy woman in her own right. And she does this through the field of architecture. She gets involved in her first major architectural project, seen here, which is the Hacienda del Pozo de Verona, located in Pleasanton, California. She commissions Albert Schweinfurth, who had made a name for himself designing the California building at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. He is the architect that she commissions in the same year that the nation goes through the Panic of 1893 and begins to slide into a depression. Now, as Schweinfurth is developing this project, Phoebe Hearst does force him to include some of her suggestions and designs in this building. Otherwise, it was possible that Schweinfurth would lose the commission, and commissions for architects were very hard to get in these years of the Depression. The project is completed in about 1895. Phoebe Hearst moves in 1896. And about the same time, she receives a letter from National Cathedral officials in Washington, D.C., that invite her to get involved in another architectural project, the National Cathedral School for Girls, seen here. Phoebe had long been thinking about establishing a school for the daughters of officials in Washington, D.C., so this was perfect timing. She accepts their offer. She writes a letter to them saying she is willing to offer $175,000 to complete this project. She suggests that they select the architect, which they do, who is J.W. Gibson of New York. And he too incorporates her ideas in the design for this building. Now, excuse me, as this project is unfolding, Phoebe Hearst gets involved in what is really the most important architectural project of her life. One day in October of 1896, as the school is entering its final stages of completion here, she sits down in her apartment in the Palace Hotel here in San Francisco and writes a letter to the University of California Regents, in which she offers to them an architectural plan funded entirely by her with money as no object. And this plan has three parts. The first part is the George Hearst Memorial Mining Building, seen here. She wants to honor her, the memory of her deceased husband. The second part is what will be called the Hearst Hall, and she makes a strategic decision at the time not to mention the function of this building, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then the third part of her plan is an international architectural competition to get architects to design an ideal university, namely UC. Now, as the regents are considering her architectural plan, women of the Pacific Association of Collegiate Alumni and other female activists in the Bay Area lobby the UC regents to hire the first female regent. And many of these women think Phoebe Apperson Hearst is the perfect candidate for this position. So while their lobbying campaign gains momentum to make Hearst the first female regent, President Kellogg at the university puts Hearst in touch with Bernard Maybeck, who is a drawing instructor at the university. And Hearst and Maybeck become fast friends. They get along very well. They work well together. And so Maybeck is associated with Hearst architectural plan from the start. And so Hearst and Maybeck decide they're going to lobby Regent Jacob Reinstein to get the university regents to accept and approve her plan. So Hearst is using her unique blend of intelligence, her interpersonal skills, and her economic clout to win over the university administration. As a result of her offering this plan, it has yet to be approved, mind you, just based on the mere fact that she offered it, Phoebe Apperson Hearst becomes the first female regent of the University of California, all right, on equal terms with men on the board. She's the only woman, but she has all the rights and privileges of all the men on the board, including the right to vote. Then, shortly after she takes her seat on the Board of Regents, the regents vote to grant Regent Hearst formal political and legal power over her entire plan. They accept and approve her plan, and she is given power to control the realization of this project from start to finish, which she does. This is rather unusual. You just don't see this happening too often in the 19th century. She then sends Bernard Maybeck off to Europe with his wife, which was a dream come true for them, to recruit architects to submit designs. The jurors are selected for the competition. Hearst goes off to Europe to be present when the winner is announced. And this is the winning design by Henri-Émile Bernard, a Beaux-Arts trained prominent French architect. And this competition really puts Hearst and the university on the map. They build a worldwide reputation as a result of the holding of this international architectural competition. After the winner is announced, Regent Hearst invites Bernard, all expenses paid, to come to Berkeley and stay for a while to revise and tweak his design so it fits the topography of Berkeley. He accepts the offer. He comes to Berkeley, but he doesn't stay very long. He figures he can get more accomplished in Paris, France. He gets up and leaves, and he ruffles Regent Hearst's feathers. She anticipated that he would stay longer. She finds that Bernard is difficult to deal with, so she fires him and hires John Galen Howard to do the revisions first on the George Hearst Memorial Mining Building. And he is assisted by Julia Morgan, who graduates from the Department of Engineering at the University of California. Now, while the memorial building is being worked on by Howard and Morgan, President Kellogg of the university decides to resign and retire from the university. And the regents now have to consider hiring a new president. And before Kellogg goes, he selects Regent Hearst to be on the committee to find a new president. And eventually the committee focuses on Benjamin Ide Wheeler, seen here with Regent Hearst marching into a commencement day ceremonies at the university. In 1899, Wheeler goes off to New York, which is where Phoebe Hearst is, visiting Willie and his family, to ask her for her vote to make him the new president and to find out how much money she's willing to give to the university, basically. He wants to know her financial commitment. And she tells him she'll support him as the new president, and she also commits herself to offer financial support to the university. So in October of 1899, he's officially inaugurated as the new president of the university. And from this point on, Regent Hearst and President Benjamin Ide Wheeler share and exert power together at the university, as well as separately and independently. The regents, remember, oversee President Wheeler, the faculty, and the staff at the university. So this is quite an arrangement. It works quite well. Hearst and Wheeler get along very well, and they too become friends. In the meantime, Bernard Maybeck has been commissioned to design Hearst Hall, and it is completed and opened in 1901. Here is the main floor, and you can see there the lights on the ceiling, which give the place sort of a magical quality. And then there's this Gothic looking arch, the back, and then the rest of the place looks like this big, comfortable living room. Hearst, by this time, announced the function of this building. She wanted this building to benefit women on campus. Now, women are going to use the building as well as men, but her primary purpose was to open this building so women would have a place to go on campus. Women were in a hostile environment at the university in this period. Most men did not want them there. The only place women were allowed to gather at the university before Hearst Hall was opened is they were allowed to eat their lunch in the corner in North Hall. And that was it. So when Hearst Hall opened, this was an absolute boon to women. They were absolutely thrilled that this hall was open. It was a place for them to meet, to network, to get involved in activities, to make presentations, and to use as a foundation to challenge men on campus, which they do. Inside Hearst Hall is a women's gym. Now, excuse me, men could use Harmon Gym on campus before Hearst Hall was open. And they were also allowed to attend physical education classes 5 times a week. Women on campus before Hearst Hall opened could only use Harmon Gym 3 times a week, and they were not allowed to take physical education classes. Now, men had to be physically examined by a medical examiner before they could use Harmon Gym. So female students on campus realized that, if we're going to use the women's gym in Hearst Hall, we need to hire a female medical examiner to examine us to make sure that we're fit to use the gym. So one day, female students go to Regent Hearst and they ask her for advice on how to present a petition to the Board of Regents to hire a female medical examiner. Hearst gives them advice, they present their petition, and eventually President Wheeler and the Regents approve the appointment of Dr. Mary Ritter as the female medical examiner and as a lecturer in hygiene in the Department of Physical Culture. And Dr. Ritter announces publicly that it is Regent Hearst that makes this appointment possible. Ritter becomes the first female faculty member with an academic title and a salary at the university, albeit part-time and paid by Hearst. That part-time position turns into a full-time position not long after. And that opens the door to the university hiring its first full-time female tenured faculty member at the University of California. Then not long after, in early 1902, President Wheeler announces that all women would be required to take physical culture and gym classes 5 times per week at the university because this is what Regent Hearst wanted. So we can see how Hearst and Wheeler were working pretty well there together. All right, now while all of this is going on, this is an incredibly active period for Phoebe Hearst. I mean, there's a lot she is involved in. While this is all taking place, Hearst now commissions Bernard Maybeck to design her second major mansion called Wintoon. This is located in Siskiyou County. As far as I know, it's still there. Yeah. Between Mount Shasta and Mount Lassen, near the Oregon border. And it's named after a peaceful tribe of California Native Americans that used to live on this land before Hearst and others had purchased this property. Now, in the 19th and early 20th century, it was inappropriate for particularly women to discuss women in power in the same breath in public. And it's a rare occasion when you find men who are willing to talk about women in power publicly. I did not run across that very often. So in having Maybeck design the second major mansion, Phoebe Hearst, who did like power, she loved power, she liked having it, she liked exerting it, is expressing her power through the building of this mansion and, you know, trying to make people think of her as a queen with divine right to rule. I mean, she was very confident as this portion of her life. So Maybeck goes from designing $5,000 and $6,000 homes in the Bay Area to designing this mansion at a cost of over $100,000, which in today's money would be over $3 million. And Wintoon is far greater in size and more magnificent and extravagant than the Hacienda del Pozo de Verona. So, you know, Hearst is expressing her power here, again, through the field of architecture, which was acceptable at the time. While she's building Wintoon, she wants to expand her power further at the University of California. And she tries to do this by coming up with the idea that the university should establish a new department and museum of anthropology at the university. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, wealthy women usually got involved in museum development. It was wealthy men who got involved in museum building. So by trying to realize this new project of a department and museum of anthropology, Phoebe Apperson Hearst is getting involved in museum development as well as museum building. You just don't find many women actually building museums during this period. Now, she has a vision for this department and museum. She wants it to serve the general public. She wants to help people gain a broader appreciation of other cultures, races, customs, traditions, beliefs, material objects, like the one she saw on display in European museums that she often visited when she went to Europe. So the first step that she takes in trying to realize this new department and museum is she begins to create and fund archaeological and anthropological expeditions and build anthropological collections. And the very first important one that she creates is the William Phoebe Apperson Hearst expedition and collection. William Pepper becomes her best friend. He is the provost of the University of Pennsylvania. He worked for the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Paleontology. While she is building this expedition and collection, Hearst sends Zelia Nuttall off to Russia to gather information about material objects and artifacts to hand over to Phoebe Hearst so that she is able to make all the purchasing decisions for the material objects that she purchases over the years. Nobody else made these decisions except her. Phoebe Hearst then goes to Egypt. She's seen here on her camel. You can see the camel there. A little bit higher than anybody else in the group. And she builds a name for herself in Egypt as an astute buyer of Egyptian antiquities. And while all of this is going on, she is building expeditions in Mexico, in the Yucatan, in Peru. She is very active. By this point, the University of Pennsylvania and UC now vie with each other for her support. And over time, Regent Hearst backs away from her involvement in the University of Pennsylvania, and she begins to focus her attention on UC. She amasses almost 100 cases of material objects and artifacts, and she sends them to UC. And they don't know what to do with all of this material. So really that puts pressure on them to start thinking about this. And President Benjamin Ide Wheeler finally decides to form a committee at the university to take steps to develop a new department and museum of anthropology. Regent Hearst is on the committee. President Wheeler is on the committee. The committee is headed by Frederick Ward Putnam of the Harvard Peabody Museum. Alice Cunningham Fletcher is a member of the committee. She had worked with Putnam. Zelia Nuttall, and then John C. Merriam, who was a researcher in paleontology at the university. These were some of the most prominent people in the field of anthropology at the time. The meetings are held in Hearst's hacienda, and over time they begin to discuss what they're going to do to actually create this new department and museum. Now, at one of these meetings, Nuttall suggests that Regent Hearst and President Wheeler listened to the suggestions of Franz Boas, who is the first faculty member in anthropology at Columbia University. And he suggests to Hearst and Wheeler that they should hire his first PhD student in anthropology, a man by the name of Alfred Kroeber. Hearst and Wheeler agree. They hire Kroeber, and this triggers a philosophical and political battle between Regent Hearst, university officials, and scholars over the shape and the direction of the new field of anthropology and the new department and museum at the university. Hearst has her own vision for the department and museum. She wants these entities to focus on teaching and broadening the public's appreciation of material objects. But President Wheeler, Putnam, and Kroeber want to build an academic reputation for the department and professionalize the department. And Kroeber eventually challenges Regent Hearst's power over the new department and museum. It was her money financing the entire endeavor. And that brings Regent Hearst to the point where in 1902, she decides she wants to fire Alfred Kroeber, who was the only faculty member in the new department at the time, and replace him with Dr. William Brigham, who was the director of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, Hawaii, who shared her vision for the new department and museum. So one day in 1902, the committee takes a vote on whether to retain Kroeber or replace him. And by this point, Regent Hearst had expected to get her way. I mean, she had gotten her way entirely since she had been placed on the Board of Regents. They take the vote and Regent Hearst loses the vote. The men place limits on her power at the university by casting this vote. She's upset. She's deeply hurt. She felt as though she was being taken advantage of by the university, and particularly the men at the university. And she believed that they saw her as nothing more than a money machine. So she leaves Berkeley. She goes on an around the world tour. She winds up in her Paris apartment. And in late May of 1904, Phoebe Apperson Hearst announces publicly that she is withdrawing her financial backing from the University of California's Department and Museum of Anthropology. In other words, she's turning the tables on men. She is setting limits on them, on the university, on the faculty, on the department and museum, because they could not operate without her money. Now she does give them half of the money that they need to run the department and museum, but she forces them to look to public and institutional financing for the other part. Now, men are shocked that she has done this. This is pretty unusual. Putnam tries everything he can think of to get Hearst to change her mind, including suggesting that they put the Hearst name on the museum, which Phoebe Hearst rejects. She does not want her name on the museum. She believes if her name is on the museum, nobody will want to donate to the museum. The Hearst name isn't an attractive thing to get people to donate money. Then she resigns as regent. University men beg her to stay. I mean, they did not want her to go. And after, much discussion back and forth, and this is about 1906, Hearst decides to remain on the Board of Regents, but from this point on, she's much less involved with university affairs. She returns to California in her hacienda from Paris in 1907. And once she's back, Hearst was not one to rest on her laurels. She loved work. She loved working and being involved in women's organizations. But when she returns, she realizes that if she's going to become active again, she's got to resurrect her philanthropic career some way. She's got to jog people's memories about her past accomplishments and her work in women's organizations. But the trick is, how's she going to do this? And between 1911 and 1915, primarily, it's the National YWCA and the Panama-Pacific International Exposition to be held here in San Francisco in 1915 that provide her with the right opportunities to resurrect her philanthropic career. By this time, this is 1911, Hearst has the stature and the reputation to be connected to elite politicians such as Theodore Roosevelt, who is right there, President Roosevelt, and she's right here. This is at a Charter Day ceremony in 1911. And it's in this year that Phoebe Hearst decides to launch a campaign that, from her perspective, is really involving politics. From her hacienda, she used the hacienda as her foundation, to convince women as well as men that she wants to serve in some capacity at the PPIE. And she wants to convince women to elect her as head of the Women's Board, the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. And she wants to convince both women and men that with her involvement, their work and activities will be a success. So she entertains between 1911 and 1915 over 6,000 guests. I mean, this is an incredible number of people, many of whom are connected with the exposition, to demonstrate that she has the political and economic clout, the skills, the financial savvy, the connections to make their work and activities and the exposition in general a success. And her campaign works. In 1911, she is seen here signing the Women's Board Constitution. She was elected head of the Women's Board. The Women's Board is another incorporated legal body. All the members have the right to vote. But in the Constitution and bylaws, it states specifically that the head of the Women's Board is nothing more than a ceremonial position. But Hearst and the women members of the board aspire to turn that official position into one with real power and authority. And this is going to be tricky. How was she going to do this? The National YWCA gives her the chance to do this. In May of 1912, Hearst hosts what's going to be called a Hacienda Conference for the National YWCA. It's a West Coast conference for women and girls who are members of the National YWCA. And over 300 of these women and girls attend. There are white women and girls, Japanese, Chinese, Native American, young women and girls all attend this conference, and they're absolutely thrilled with the opportunity to be at this conference and get to know one another and develop networks and be introduced into all kinds of new experiences and knowledge. They learn at this conference how to become persons of power themselves. And it's at this conference that National Y officials make it known to Phoebe Hearst that they want her to represent the National Y and their politics at the PPIE. In other words, they want Hearst to promote and advance their political issues that they're interested in, like a decent wage for women, so forth and so on, right? And Hearst essentially agrees to do this. Then what Phoebe Hearst does is she commissions Julia Morgan to design a Silmar. This another idea of Phoebe Hearst. She was full of ideas. This is the Phoebe Apperson Hearst Administration Building designed by Julia Morgan. And once this is completed, a Silmar becomes the YWCA West Coast base of operations and power during the PPIE. This is their foundation that they use while the exposition is open and operating. And as a result of the completion of a Silmar, Hearst is elected to regional and national positions of leadership and power in the YWCA. So that's where she gets her power, from the Y, and she's acting in both of those capacities at the same time, the head of the Women's Board and in national leadership in the YWCA. Now, the political and power structure of the exposition is tricky and complicated. The Women's Board has separate and independent power of its own. It's a corporated legal body. There are stockholders, so forth and so on. The Men's Board has its own power, separate from the Women's Board. But the way the exposition structure is set up, the Men's Board ultimately connects whatever the Women's Board wants to do, right? Yet the Women's Board has its own power. And Phoebe Hearst, because of her position now, is given the honor to promote the California building. Here she is standing in front of the California building banner. This is going to be an important building because it will house the Women's Board as well as the Men's Board at the exposition, and those two boards oversee all the work and activities of women and men respectively. Hearst is then given the honor of the groundbreaking ceremony. This is in June of 1914 for the National YWCA building at the exposition. There is no women's building at this exposition like there were at other expositions. The YWCA building essentially becomes the women's building. And had it not been for Hearst, this building would have never been constructed and open and operating. It was her money, her connections, her financial savvy that made it possible. And she commissions Julie Morgan to design the inside, which is a place primarily for women, but men and women use this building during the exposition. It's a place where they can come and relax, read. They can get health care here. They can listen to presentations on a variety of topics. There was a lot going on inside this building. And of course, the building, any building, was one way for anyone to express their power and stature in the society at the time. Now, as the exposition winds down, Phoebe Hearst, as head of the Women's Board, leaves the Women's Board with no debt at the end of the exposition. The male board could not say the same. They wound up in debt by the time the exposition closed. So Phoebe Apperson Hearst certainly had built by this point a national and international reputation for herself. Now, by the closing of the PPIE, when the lights went out forever, Phoebe Hearst had broadened her political agenda to focus on suffrage. And here she is marching in July of 1916 as a suffragist in the moderate camp in Woodrow Wilson's Preparedness Day parade. And her public image was always an image of being a dignified, respectable woman. Now, Phoebe Hearst got involved in the suffrage campaign initially in 1896. She became the largest single cash donor of the suffrage movement in that year. But from 1896 to 1911, she was reluctant to publicly endorse the suffrage campaign. Primary reason for that was she was very uncomfortable with the militant, confrontational, aggressive methods of radical suffragists. But in 1911, just before Californians took the vote on whether to give women the right to vote, Phoebe Hearst, 5 days before that election, publicly endorses suffrage. And there were many who argued that she was a key to victory. Her endorsement gave the movement momentum, and they did indeed win in 1911. Then shortly after that, the exposition closes, and she is invited then to march in the Preparedness Day Parade. And she does so as a suffragist, as I mentioned, but a moderate one. She and the other women who are invited to march in this parade are sent death threats before they march. They ignore them. Phoebe Hearst is given the place of honor at the head of the Women's Board column in the parade. And she and the other women march from the beginning to the end of the parade without any physical assistance. They don't ride in cars or lean on arms or anything like that. And they survive a bombing during this parade. There are bombs that are thrown into the crowd, killing 40 women, men, and children. And the women survive to demonstrate that they are fit enough to receive full citizenship rights, including the right to vote. Now, Phoebe Hearst avoided being killed by a bomb in this parade, but not by the flu epidemic. She goes off to visit her son in New York in 1919. She contracts the flu there. She's able to come back to the hacienda, but the flu turns into pneumonia, and she passes away on April 13th of 1919. This is her funeral at what we now call Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco. And one measure of her status and reputation by this time is that she has some of the most powerful men in California as her honorary pallbearers: senators, governors, president of UC and Stanford, as well as the mayor of San Francisco, among others. So if we step back and sort of assess Phoebe Apperson Hearst and the arc of her life, I think she teaches us about how women, especially wealthy women, acquired power and used it to benefit the less fortunate, and primarily women as well as men, especially at the University of California and at the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we have some time for some questions, and we'll start with some questions from folks in the audience. Does anybody have a question or comment? Here in the front row. And then we'll take Paul.
Very nice talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It seems that Phoebe Hearst had a lot of influence on Maybeck and Julia Morgan, who both became very well-known and revered California architects. Would their careers have been so good without?
No, this is a very interesting point. Phoebe Hearst had a knack for selecting people to work with very well who advance her wishes and help her achieve her goals. When Julia Morgan was a student in the Department of Engineering at UC, Phoebe Hearst offered to help her financially. Morgan rejected her offer, but later Phoebe Hearst does help Julia Morgan get started on her professional career as an architect. As you heard, Phoebe Hearst commissioned Julia Morgan to do a number of projects that she was involved in. And Maybeck, as I said, they just got along really well together. And they worked well together. And Maybeck, I don't know, he may have had a really good career, but I mean, obviously the projects he did with Regent Hearst really set his career on fire. Yeah, and it was true for both Morgan and Maybeck.
Paul.
So 2 comments. First of all, you mentioned the National Cathedral School for Girls there. I attended the consecration of the cathedral in 1990 or 91.
Oh, wonderful.
And Phoebe's name was one of 3 people mentioned in the prayers.
Really?
That day during the service. The other one was the first bishop. I think his name was Hobart. And the other person was, I don't remember.
Interesting name.
So she was considered so important 60 or 70 years after she died to the founding of the cathedral.
Yeah.
And she's there. The second comment is wind tomb. So the building you showed is in fact a 1904 wind tomb designed by Maybeck. That burnt down in 1930.
Uh-huh.
And it was Julia Morgan who redeveloped the property into 6 or 8 houses for William Randolph Hearst.
Right. Willie commissioned Julia Morgan, of course, to design the Enchanted Hill or Hearst Castle, which was designed and built in honor of Willie's mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst. So yes, Morgan certainly continued her relationship with the Hearsts after Phoebe Hearst died. Mhm.
Another question. Yeah.
Did Phoebe Hearst reconcile her differences with Kroeber?
She did. Yes, she did. They came to an understanding. One of the reasons why Phoebe Hearst lost this vote is throughout her entire life, she had an ardent desire to have a higher education. And women in the 19th century were not allowed to do that. In 1890, for example, only 11% of college and university students were women in the United States at the time. And so Phoebe Hearst understood, as a result of losing this vote with Kroeber, that she did not have the educational and academic credentials to be able to understand really what these prominent people in the field of anthropology wanted to do. She would have loved to have been seen as a professional by then, but didn't work out. So later on, after she healed her wounds, took her a while, she and Kroeber communicate with each other. They do reconcile their differences. Kroeber respects her. He is willing to keep her up to date on all of the department and museum activities. He sends her regular reports, and she eventually admits to him that she doesn't have all the advanced knowledge she needs to know what's going on, but she knows enough to understand the reports that he's sending to her. So yes, they do.
So we have a question from Zoom here, and it says, I'm wondering if you could comment on Hearst's relationship with or views on Jane Stanford, another powerful woman in education in California.
Yes. Phoebe Hearst and Jane Stanford knew one another. Jane Stanford did pay attention to Phoebe Hearst's career. And at one point, when Phoebe Hearst was involved in the Golden Gate Kindergarten Association, she wrote Phoebe Apperson Hearst, stating that Phoebe Apperson Hearst's name became a household word in the area as a result of her involvement in the GGKA. But beyond that, they didn't have a whole lot of connection. Both of them were involved in the kindergarten movement, and Jane Stanford was also involved in the GGKA, but they weren't deep friends, let's put it that way.
Okay.
But they did know one another.
Well, is there anything you can say about their similarities or differences in regards to faculty hiring at the university level, evolving views on academic independence and teaching and in that area?
Yes, as some of you may know, Jane Stanford controlled the entire university. So she, in some ways, had more power over Stanford than Phoebe Apperson Hearst did as one regent on the UC Board of Regents. And it's my understanding that while Jane Stanford did control the university, she too fired faculty members as well. So Phoebe Hearst was not alone.
I think that's what the viewer is getting
Yes,
at there.
yes, yes.
She was not alone in those actions.
Not alone, yes.
Do we have another question here? Yes, Jeffrey.
Yeah, so I actually went to UC Berkeley, so I did have classes in Kroeber Hall.
Oh,
and Miller Hall.
All right,
And
great.
One of the most beautiful buildings was the Hearst Mining Company. It's haunted, but beautiful. I had a question about around 1906 when she had come back to San Francisco. Her developments, were they impacted by the earthquake, and what stories did you learn there?
When the earthquake occurred, Phoebe Apperson Hearst was in France. So her one of her managers wrote her to explain the devastating effects on San Francisco, but her hacienda wasn't damaged all that much. And really her manager told her, well, there's no need to come back because, you know, your properties are basically okay. So Phoebe Hearst didn't have much of an experience directly with the earthquake.
Another question from here in the audience, anyone? There is a question, did Hearst support John Muir's efforts, another contemporary?
She did get involved. Well, she sent money. She didn't become too active in organizations to save the redwoods. She didn't have any contact, as far as I can recall, with John Muir directly, but she was interested in environmental issues, but that wasn't a top priority for her.
Yes.
I wanted to take to research. Oh my. Well, I did this while teaching 5 classes, sometimes 6. It took me 35 years. But I completed it, so I get a gold star.
We also have some flyers here. If you're interested in acquiring the book, there is a 30% discount off of the book here. So I'm going to leave these flyers up here if you would like to take one of these. I'll also send them out, or that information out, with a link to the Zoom audience that's with us tonight. So any last questions from anyone here in the audience before we wrap up? Yes.
Just one, you never mentioned during the whole time her son. What was someone taking care of him or being with him? Because it sounds like she went.
Well, Phoebe Hearst tried to control Willie. Didn't work out too well.
Well, but she was gone so much is what I noticed. You know, she was in Paris, she was in Egypt, etc.
Yeah, well, they were, you know, Phoebe Hearst raised William Randolph Hearst to be a power in politics.
Yeah,
That was a conscious decision on her part.
right.
They were separated a lot because WRH wound up in New York and she was on the West Coast. And so when she did see him, which was not all that frequently, she traveled to New York. He didn't come out her way, interestingly. I hadn't thought about that. He didn't come out her way too much. And as a matter of fact, when she was in Europe, it was William Randolph Hearst who had he had at the moment a control over the land that she built the hacienda on. And when she found out that he was going to build his own mansion on the land, she came back from Europe and took the land away from him. It was her land, technically, you know, legally, it was her land. And she kept Schweinfurth, who Willie had thought about commissioning originally for his mansion that he was going to build, but not to be.
Any, yes,
I'm sure she
Sure.
had the money for a nanny, right?
What was that?
she had the money for a nanny.
Ah,
Right.
yes, yes, she did have a governess, but I'm here to tell you that, you know, when George got up and left, she did have a governess, Eliza Pike was her name, but that was Phoebe's only friend. And, you know, it wasn't too acceptable for women married to wealthy men to have friends as their servants as friends. But she did have a governess to help her out, yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask this one last question because a couple people have asked it online.
Okay.
Nobody's asked it here, but I've been thinking it. Did she ever have a romantic relationship with either a man or a woman after her husband died?
Okay, no, there were rumors. There were rumors.
That's what we want to know. What are
Yes,
the rumors?
There are the rumors that she might marry Senator Hill, but I have never found any information to corroborate any of that.
Oh. You let us down on the very last question. We were looking for some hot gossip
She
there.
would, well, you understand why.
Oh, yeah. you-
She would.
She couldn't afford it.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
So we're at about 7:15 and we're going to wrap up. But Alexandra's going to be around for a little while. If you'd like to talk to her and pick up a flyer, they're here at the front of the room. But I'm going to take this moment to thank you for
Thank
coming.
you.
It's been
Great
great
class.
having you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone here in the room and on Zoom for attending this Book Club of California program. Our next program is going to be an online only talk. It's titled Monster She Wrote. This will be a presentation by Melanie Anderson, author and assistant professor of English at Delta State University in Cleveland, Mississippi,
Wow.
and Lisa Kroger, who is an author. They're both also the host of a podcast called Monster She Wrote, and it's a book that they turned into from the podcast. You can register to attend that online program using the BCC emails that you might be getting. There's a registration link in there, our programs emails, or you can go online to bccbooks.org/programs to register. Again, thank you everyone for joining us here in person. Thank you everyone for joining us virtually via Zoom. We look forward to seeing you again, either here in the room or in Zoom in the near future. Thanks for being part of our community.
We did it.